When my daughter-in-law demanded I take a DNA test to prove I deserved any part of the inheritance my husband left behind, I thought she was playing some cruel joke. But the venom in her eyes and the satisfied smirk on my son's face told me this was real. They truly believed I was an outsider, a gold digger who had manipulated their father and deserved nothing. I walked into that laboratory alone, their cruel whispers following me like poisoned arrows, each word designed to humiliate me and break my spirit. They were so certain those results would expose me, destroy my reputation, and strip away everything I had sacrificed 43 years to build. But when Dr. Harrison opened that envelope, her expression shifted from professional detachment to something shocked and deeply uncomfortable. My son leaned forward, ready to celebrate what he thought would be my public humiliation. Instead, he froze, his mouth hanging open, all color draining from his face until he looked like he'd seen his own ghost. I knew in that moment the truth inside those papers was nothing like the twisted story they'd constructed in their poisoned minds. Something far more devastating was about to surface. Something that would turn their greedy schemes into dust and ashes. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just destroy their plans. It shattered every lie they'd told themselves about our family and led to consequences they never imagined in their darkest nightmares. My name is Rebecca Hartley. I'm 64 years old, a former art gallery curator who spent decades building connections with artists and collectors across 5 countries. I've been a widow for 18 months now, ever since my beloved David passed away after complications from a stroke. Not a morning goes by that I don't reach across the bed expecting to find his warmth there, before reality crashes down on me again. The evening this nightmare began, I drove to my son Adrian's house, thinking I was coming for a simple birthday dinner. The spring air carried the scent of jasmine that David always loved, and I found myself talking to his memory as I pulled into their circular driveway. "Give me strength today, my love," I whispered into the silence. I had absolutely no idea how desperately I would need that strength in the hours ahead. Meredith answered the door before I could even knock, her smile bright and sharp like broken glass. She wore an emerald silk dress and pearl earrings that probably cost more than my monthly pension. "Rebecca," she said, not Mom like she used to call me when she wanted favors. "So glad you could make it. We've arranged a special place for you." The special place turned out to be a tiny folding chair positioned far away from the main dining table where Adrian and Meredith would sit like royalty. One cheap placemat, mismatched silverware, a glass of tap water already poured, like I was a beggar invited to watch them feast. "It's for your comfort," Meredith explained with fake sweetness. "You mentioned your hip was bothering you last time we talked. And this chair has better support." I had never mentioned any such thing, but I nodded and took my humiliating seat, swallowing the anger rising in my throat. Adrian emerged from the kitchen, carrying what looked like catered food still in its containers. And when his eyes met mine, I saw something that broke my heart. Guilt mixed with weakness. The look of a man who'd stopped fighting for what was right and started following orders from someone who didn't love him. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice hollow. "Thanks for coming tonight." We ate in uncomfortable silence for the first 20 minutes. I complimented the meal, even though I could see the restaurant labels on the containers stacked by the sink. Meredith accepted my compliments without acknowledging that we both knew she was lying. Adrian pushed his food around his plate like a child avoiding vegetables, unable to meet my eyes. Then Meredith set down her fork with deliberate precision. "Rebecca, we need to discuss something important." Her voice had changed, becoming harder and more businesslike. "With David's estate still being processed, Adrian and I have been thinking about the future. Our future and what's fair." I waited, my hands steady around my water glass, even though my heart was pounding. "We need you to take a DNA test," she announced, her eyes glittering with triumph. "To confirm you were really Adrian's biological mother before any inheritance decisions are finalized." The words hit me like a physical slap, though I kept my face carefully neutral. 38 years of raising this boy. 38 years of scraped knees and school projects and heartbreak over girls and celebrating his victories. And now this. "Meredith," I said slowly, keeping my voice level, "why on earth would you ask such a thing?" She leaned forward, enjoying her moment of power. "Because Adrian deserves to know the truth. And frankly, we've heard certain rumors over the years. Things that make us wonder about the real story of your marriage to David. Questions about whether Adrian is actually your biological child, or if there's something you've been hiding all these decades." I turned to my son, searching his face for any sign of the boy I'd raised. "Adrian, do you believe this?" He couldn't look at me directly, his eyes sliding away like a coward's. "Mom, it's just a formality. You shouldn't be worried if you have nothing to hide. Meredith says that real mothers don't run from simple genetic testing." Real mothers. The phrase echoed in my mind like thunder. I had taught this boy to read, walked him through his first day of kindergarten, sat up with him through fevers and nightmares. I'd held his hand at his father's funeral while he sobbed against my shoulder, and now he questioned whether I was his real mother. My phone rang, a small mercy. Sophia Chen's name flashed on the screen, my closest friend since college. "Excuse me," I said, rising from my insulting little chair. "I need to take this." Meredith's sigh was theatrical and dismissive. "Always running away from difficult conversations, aren't you?" I stepped onto their back patio and answered the call, but barely heard Sophia's cheerful voice asking about our weekly coffee date. Through the window, I watched Meredith pull a document from her designer handbag and slide it across the table toward my empty seat. Her smile, victorious and cruel. When I returned, the paper sat waiting like a coiled snake. A consent form for DNA testing, already filled out except for my signature. Meredith's smile was cold and calculating. "Sign this by tomorrow morning, Rebecca. Otherwise, we'll have to assume you're hiding something that disqualifies you from David's estate entirely. We've already consulted with attorneys, and they agree we have grounds to contest your claims if you refuse." I looked at the document, then at my son, who still couldn't meet my eyes. Then at the woman who had somehow poisoned him against his own mother. "I'll think about it," I said quietly. But as I drove home that night, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, I wasn't thinking about a DNA test. I was thinking about David and the locked wooden box he'd left in our bedroom closet, the one with words carved into the lid that I'd never fully understood until this moment. To be opened only when they question your place in this family. The house felt emptier than ever when I pulled into the driveway. David used to leave the porch light burning for me, a small beacon that said someone cared whether I made it home safely. Now the only light came from the street lamp on the corner, casting long shadows across the walkway, where we'd planted hydrangeas together 15 years ago. I sat in my car for a long time, unable to move. The consent form Meredith had given me lay on the passenger seat, its crisp white paper almost glowing in the darkness. I could still hear her voice, sharp and certain, demanding proof of something I'd never questioned in 38 years of motherhood. When I finally went inside, the silence wrapped around me like a shroud. I dropped my keys on the hall table, where David used to stack his medical journals, and made my way through the dark house without turning on lights. I knew every corner by heart, every creaking floorboard, every place where his presence still lingered. His portrait hung above the fireplace, a professional photograph taken on our 40th wedding anniversary. I stood before it in the darkness, studying the man I'd loved for 43 years. He'd been 52 in that photo, his hair just starting to gray at the temples, his smile holding the quiet confidence of a man who'd built something lasting. Even in that frozen moment, I could see the intelligence in his eyes, as if he'd known what challenges lay ahead for us. "What should I do, David?" I whispered to the empty room. And then, as clearly as if he were standing beside me, I heard his voice from those final days in the hospital. His hand had been so thin in mine, his breathing labored, but his words were urgent and precise. "Rebecca, if anything ever happens, trust Margaret Winters completely. She knows everything about our family, everything that matters. She'll help you when the time comes." At the time, I thought he was talking about the will, about financial arrangements, about the practical details lawyers handle. Now I wondered if he'd meant something else entirely. I walked to our bedroom, to the closet where I'd kept his things exactly as he'd left them. On the top shelf, behind his hat boxes and photo albums, sat the carved wooden box I'd seen 1,000 times but never opened. I brought it down carefully, as if it might shatter, and carried it to our bed. Inside were the treasures of our life together. A dried rose from my bridal bouquet, letters David had written me during his years in medical school, Adrian's first baby tooth wrapped in tissue paper, and there, at the bottom, a sealed envelope I'd noticed before, but never thought to question. David had placed it there years ago, and I'd assumed it contained something sentimental. Perhaps a love letter, meant for me to discover after he was gone. But now, I read the words written on the front in his careful handwriting, and my blood turned to ice. "To be opened only when they question your place in this family." He had known. Somehow, impossibly, David had known this day would come. He'd prepared for it, left this envelope like a time capsule waiting for exactly the right moment. My fingers trembled as I held it up to the light, trying to see through the paper, trying to glimpse whatever truth lay hidden inside. But I couldn't bring myself to open it. Not yet. A memory surfaced, washing over me with such force I had to close my eyes. David at 43. Standing in our living room, holding the adoption papers that would make Adrian legally ours. The boy had been 6 months old, abandoned at the hospital by a teenage mother who'd left only a first name and a teddy bear. "He's ours now," David had said, looking at me over the sleeping baby's head. "Forever. Don't let anyone ever tell you otherwise." I had promised him that day. I'd sworn on everything holy that I would protect this child, that I would be his mother in every way that mattered, that nothing and no one would ever make him feel unwanted. And I'd kept that promise for 38 years. Tears streamed down my face as I placed the envelope back in the box. I wasn't ready. Whatever David had hidden there, whatever truth he'd preserved for this moment, I couldn't face it tonight. Part of me still hoped that tomorrow Adrian would call, apologetic and ashamed, telling me Meredith had gone too far and that he knew I was his mother without needing any test to prove it. I closed the wooden box and returned it to the closet, then lay down on my side of the bed, staring at the ceiling, as I'd done every night since David left me. Sleep was almost claiming me when my phone buzzed with an email notification. Unusual at this late hour. I almost ignored it, but something made me reach for the device. The sender was Margaret Winters, attorney at law. I sat up suddenly, fully awake. Margaret had been David's closest friend since college, and she'd handled all our legal affairs for over 30 years. The message was brief but urgent. "Rebecca, forgive the late hour, but this cannot wait. David left specific instructions that I must share with you before any DNA test takes place. There are things you need to know. Things he made me promise to reveal only under certain circumstances. Those circumstances have now arrived. Come to my office tomorrow morning at 9. Tell no one, especially not Adrian or his wife. David was very clear about that. This is urgent. I read the email 5 times, my heart pounding. David had prepared for this. He'd seen it coming, perhaps even known who would betray me and how. And whatever secrets he'd left with Margaret Winters, I was about to discover them. I didn't sleep that night. Margaret's email played on repeat in my mind, each word carrying weight I couldn't fully comprehend. David had left instructions, had prepared for this exact scenario. But prepared for what? And how had he known to prepare at all? By morning, my eyes burned from exhaustion, and my coffee tasted like ashes. I was standing at the kitchen window, watching the sunrise over the garden David had helped me design, when I heard a car pull into the driveway. For one hopeful moment, I thought it might be Adrian coming to apologize, to tell me this DNA nonsense had been a terrible mistake. But when I opened the door, the look on my son's face told me hope was a luxury I could no longer afford. He stood on the porch with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his shoulders hunched like he was bracing against a storm that didn't exist. He looked older than his 38 years, worn down by something I couldn't name. "Can I come in?" he asked, still not meeting my eyes. I stepped aside without a word. We sat in the living room, him on the edge of the sofa, me in my reading chair. The distance between us felt like miles instead of feet. Adrian stared at the floor, at the walls, at anywhere but my face. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the hollow echo of words that weren't his own. "Mom, I need you to understand where Meredith is coming from. She's just worried about protecting what's fair. Dad left substantial assets, and with the estate still being processed, Meredith thinks we need to make sure everything is legally clear. She says it's nothing personal." Nothing personal. The phrase hung between us like smoke. "Adrian," I said quietly, "do you doubt me? Does my son truly doubt that I'm his mother?" He flinched as if I'd struck him. His eyes darted toward mine for just a fraction of a second before skittering away. His jaw tightened, and I watched him struggle with something internal, some battle between the boy I'd raised and the man his wife had shaped. "It's not about doubt," he finally managed. "It's about documentation. Meredith says that in legal matters, feelings don't count. Only paperwork counts. Only proof. And what do you say, Adrian? What does my son say?" He didn't answer. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, until he abruptly changed the subject. "Look, Meredith found some old papers in Dad's files when we were helping sort through the house last month. She thinks there might be something important, something that affects the inheritance. She just wants transparency." My blood turned to ice. "Meredith went through your father's private files?" Adrian shifted uncomfortably. "She was helping organize. You know how much paperwork Dad kept. Someone had to go through it eventually. But I knew David. I knew how carefully he maintained his privacy, how he guarded certain documents, certain secrets. The idea of Meredith rifling through his papers, searching for ammunition to use against me, made me physically ill. "What exactly did she find?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "I don't know the details. She just said there were some things that didn't add up, some questions about the family history that need answers." He stood abruptly, eager to escape. "I have to go. Just think about signing the consent form, okay? It would make everything easier for everyone." I walked into the door, and as he stepped onto the porch, I reached out to embrace him, as I'd done every time we parted for the past 38 years. But Adrian pulled back, mumbling something about being late, and hurried to his car without looking at me again. I stood in the doorway watching him drive away, my arms empty, my heart heavier than it had ever been. That woman has poisoned him. I turned to find Sophia Chen standing at the edge of my property, concern etched across her face. She'd been my closest friend since our college days together, and since David's passing, she'd appointed herself my unofficial guardian. "Sophia," I said, my voice rough with emotion. She crossed the lawn and stood beside me, watching Adrian's car disappear around the corner. "I saw the whole thing, Rebecca. The way he couldn't look at you. The way he pulled away when you tried to hug him. That's not the boy you raised. That's a man being controlled by someone who doesn't have his best interests at heart. What am I supposed to do? The question came out broken, desperate. Sophia placed a gentle hand on my arm. You fight. You remember who you are and what you've built with that boy. And you trust that truth always finds its way home, no matter how many lies try to bury it. Before I could respond, my phone rang. Margaret Winter's name appeared on the screen. I need to take this, I told Sophia, and she nodded, squeezing my arm once before returning to her own house. Margaret, I answered, stepping inside and closing the door. Rebecca, I'm glad I caught you. Her voice was serious, measured. The voice of an attorney preparing to deliver difficult news. I've been going through David's files this morning, preparing for our meeting. I need to tell you something. I'm listening. Your husband was the most careful person I've ever known. In 40 years of practicing law, I've never met anyone who planned as thoroughly as David did. He always had a backup plan, Rebecca. Always. For everything. I thought of the envelope in the wooden box, the one I'd been too afraid to open. What are you telling me, Margaret? There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice dropped lower, more urgent. I'm telling you that David left more than a will. He left evidence, Rebecca. Documentation of things he suspected might happen after he was gone. And he left a warning. Another pause. Come to my office this afternoon. Come alone. And whatever you do, don't mention this conversation to anyone, especially not to Adrian or his wife. The line went dead, and I stood in my silent house, holding a phone that suddenly felt like a lifeline. David had known. He'd seen this coming, and somewhere in Margaret Winter's office, the truth was waiting for me. If you feel my words touching your heart, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Tell me which city you're from, so I can see how far a woman's voice can reach when she speaks her truth. Help me build this community so we can bring more stories like this to women who need to hear them. Margaret Winter's office occupied the 5th floor of a sleek glass building downtown, the kind of place where serious money came to be protected. I arrived 20 minutes early, my nerves too frayed to sit at home waiting. I spent the time in the parking garage, rehearsing conversations that might never happen, preparing myself for truths I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. When Adrian and Meredith stepped out of the elevator at exactly 9 o'clock, I realized with a sinking feeling that this wouldn't be the private meeting Margaret had promised. We received notice about a formal estate review, Meredith announced by way of greeting. She wore a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my car payment, her jewelry catching the light like tiny weapons. Apparently, there are additional documents that weren't included in the initial probate filing. Adrian stood behind her like a shadow, his eyes meeting mine briefly before sliding away. Margaret appeared in her doorway, her expression unreadable. She was a woman in her early 60s with sharp eyes behind designer glasses and the kind of steady presence that made witnesses uncomfortable on the stand. David had trusted her implicitly for over 30 years. Please come in, she said, gesturing toward 3 chairs arranged before her desk. We have important matters to discuss. Meredith claimed the center seat immediately, arranging her purse on her lap like a crown. I took the chair furthest from her, while Adrian filled the uncomfortable space between us, a buffer zone in human form. Margaret settled behind her desk and opened a leather folder with deliberate slowness. Before we begin, I want to be clear that everything discussed in this room is legally binding and will be entered into the official probate record. Dr. Hartley was very specific about the conditions under which certain documents should be revealed. Meredith leaned forward slightly, her eyes gleaming. Of course, we're here for complete transparency. The irony wasn't lost on me. Margaret began reading, her voice neutral and professional. She listed David's assets methodically. The house and property valued at just over $950,000. The savings accounts totaling nearly $600,000. The investment portfolio David had built over decades of careful planning. With each item, I watched Meredith's eyes grow brighter, her posture more alert, like a predator sensing wounded prey. Now we come to the distribution clauses, Margaret continued. David divided his estate with specific conditions attached to each portion. She paused, adjusting her glasses. Article 9, Section A states, in the event that any dispute arises regarding bloodline or biological relationship within the Hartley family, such dispute must be verified through legal DNA testing conducted by a court-approved facility. Meredith's smile spread across her face like sunrise over poisoned ground. She turned to look at me, triumph gleaming in her eyes. See? Even David knew this needed to be settled properly. He wanted the same transparency we're asking for. I said nothing. Something in Margaret's expression told me to wait, to let this play out. However, Margaret continued, her voice sharpening almost imperceptibly, Article 9, Section B states the following. The room seemed to grow smaller, the air thicker. Any party who initiates legal action, formal proceedings, or documented demands to challenge Rebecca Hartley's maternal rights or her position within this family shall automatically and irrevocably forfeit all claims to the David Hartley estate. This includes, but is not limited to, cash assets, property, investments, and personal effects. Meredith's smile froze on her face like ice forming over a lake. That's absurd, she sputtered, after a moment of stunned silence. We're not challenging anything. We're just asking reasonable questions about family history. Margaret removed her glasses and looked directly at Meredith with the patience of someone who'd spent decades dealing with people who thought they were cleverer than the law. Mrs. Hartley, the consent form you presented to Rebecca 3 days ago specifically requested DNA testing to, and I quote, confirm biological maternity before inheritance distribution. That constitutes a formal documented demand challenging her maternal status. She held up a photocopy of the very document Meredith had slid across the dinner table. David anticipated exactly this situation. He wrote these clauses himself, reviewed them with me multiple times, and had them witnessed by 2 independent parties. Meredith's face had gone pale beneath her expensive makeup. Adrian sat rigid beside her, staring at his hands as if they held answers to questions he couldn't voice. This can't be legal, Meredith insisted, her voice rising. You can't disinherit someone for asking questions. I assure you it is entirely legal, Margaret replied calmly. David was meticulous about ensuring every clause would hold up in court. He consulted 3 separate attorneys before finalizing this document. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock on Margaret's bookshelf. I watched Meredith struggle to regain her composure, her mind clearly racing to find some loophole, some escape from the trap she'd unknowingly walked into. Margaret closed the leather folder and folded her hands on top of it. There is one more matter, she said, and something in her tone made everyone sit up straighter. David left a sealed envelope in my care, separate from the will. He gave explicit instructions that it should only be opened if this exact situation occurred, if someone formally challenged Rebecca's place in the family. She reached into her desk drawer and withdrew a cream-colored envelope, aged but intact, with David's handwriting visible on the front. This envelope contains the truth about Adrian's origins. David wanted Rebecca to know everything before any DNA test takes place. Margaret looked at me, her eyes soft with compassion. He said you would understand once you read it. He said it would explain everything. The envelope from David remained unopened in my coat pocket as we drove to the DNA clinic 4 days later. Margaret had offered to let me read it privately, but Meredith had insisted we proceed with the testing first, claiming she wanted everything done in proper legal order. I suspected she simply wanted to deny me any preparation, any advantage for whatever truth David had hidden away. Dr. Patricia Harrison's clinic occupied a modern building on the east side of town, all glass and steel and clinical efficiency. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and fear, filled with people clutching numbered tickets and avoiding each other's eyes. I took a seat near the window while Adrian filled out paperwork at the reception desk, Meredith hovering over his shoulder like a vulture, pointing at various lines as if he were a child who couldn't be trusted with a simple form. She'd been insufferable all week, calling repeatedly to confirm I wouldn't change my mind, texting Adrian constant reminders about documentation and proper procedures. Now she paced the waiting room, her designer heels clicking against the tile with each anxious step. "You're not having second thoughts, are you?" she asked, stopping in front of my chair. "Because backing out now would look very suspicious." "I agreed to the test," I said quietly. "I'm here." "Good." She didn't move, standing over me like an interrogator. "I just want you to know that whatever happens, Adrian and I only want the truth." "That's all anyone really wants, isn't it? The truth." An elderly man in the chair beside me glanced up from his newspaper, his brow furrowed with concern. Meredith noticed the attention and seemed to feed on it. She raised her voice slightly, addressing me, but clearly performing for the room. "You know how it is with old people and their secrets. Things they've buried for decades. That's why they're so terrified of tests like this. Science has a way of exposing what people want to keep hidden." The elderly man set down his newspaper. "Excuse me," he said sharply, "but that's a horrible thing to say to anyone, let alone someone who appears to be your mother-in-law." Meredith's smile tightened. "This is a private family matter. Then perhaps you should discuss it privately instead of humiliating her in public." I placed a gentle hand on the man's arm. "It's all right. Thank you for your kindness." Before Meredith could respond, a nurse appeared in the doorway. "Rebecca Hartley? Dr. Harrison will see you now. Alone, please." I rose, grateful for the escape, and followed her down a long corridor, lined with diplomas and certifications. Dr. Harrison's private office was smaller than I expected, dominated by a large desk covered in files and a computer monitor, displaying what appeared to be patient records. Dr. Harrison herself was a woman in her early 50s with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She stood to shake my hand, but there was something hesitant in her manner, a weariness that put me immediately on edge. "Mrs. Hartley, please sit down. Before we proceed with the testing, there's something I need to discuss with you." I lowered myself into the chair across from her desk, my heart beginning to pound. She turned her monitor slightly away from my view and typed something, her brow furrowing as she read. "Your husband, David Hartley, was a patient here some years ago." "I didn't know that," I admitted. "He never mentioned this clinic." Dr. Harrison nodded slowly. "That's understandable. The records are quite old, and he requested strict confidentiality at the time." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "Mrs. Hartley, there's something unusual in his file. Another name is listed alongside his in connection with certain tests that were conducted." My mouth went dry. "What name?" She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the boundaries of patient privacy. "A woman named Jennifer Morrison. I cannot tell you more than that due to confidentiality laws, but given the current situation with your family, I felt you should at least know this much. Jennifer Morrison." The name meant nothing to me, and yet it landed like a physical blow. Who was this woman? Why had David come to a DNA clinic with someone I'd never heard of? In all our years together, he'd never mentioned anyone by that name, never hinted at any connection that might explain why her name would appear in his medical records. "I don't understand," I managed. David and I were married for 43 years. He never kept secrets from me. Dr. Harrison's expression softened with sympathy. Mrs. Hartley, I've learned in this profession that everyone has chapters of their life they don't share, even with those closest to them. I would suggest you speak with your attorney. If David left any documentation explaining this, that would be the place to find it. She stood, signaling that our private conversation was ending. But as I rose to leave, she placed a hand on my shoulder and leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The DNA results will take 3 days to process, but I must tell you something, Mrs. Hartley. She met my eyes with an intensity that made my skin prickle. What David left in his file here, the instructions he gave us, the information he wanted preserved, it will change everything you think you know about your husband, about your son, about your entire family. I walked back to the waiting room in a daze, David's sealed envelope burning against my chest like hot coal. Who was Jennifer Morrison, and what secrets had my husband taken to his grave? The name Jennifer Morrison haunted me through 3 sleepless nights. I searched for her the way a drowning woman searches for shore, desperate and clumsy, typing variations of her name into every database I could access. Social media, professional directories, alumni records from the university where David had studied before we met. Each search felt like a betrayal, as if I were accusing my dead husband of something unforgivable simply by asking questions. On the 3rd night, I finally found her. Jennifer Morrison had been a nurse at the hospital where David completed his residency, graduating from the nursing program 2 years before David finished medical school. The photos I discovered showed a slender woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, standing in group shots with other medical staff at what appeared to be hospital events. In one photograph dated 39 years ago, she stood beside David at what looked like a retirement party for one of the senior doctors. They weren't touching, not even standing particularly close, but something about the way she looked at him made my stomach clench. Had my husband loved another woman before me? Had he loved her during our marriage? The questions circled my mind like vultures, picking at everything I thought I knew about our life together. I could bear it no longer. The sealed envelope from David had remained in my coat pocket since that day at Margaret's office, growing heavier with each passing hour. Now I retrieved it with trembling hands and sat at the kitchen table where David and I had shared thousands of meals, raised a child, planned a future he wouldn't live to see completed. The paper tore easily beneath my fingers. Inside, I found a single photograph and a handwritten letter. The photograph showed a tiny infant with dark hair and frightened eyes, wrapped in a hospital blanket I recognized immediately. Adrian had been brought home in that same blanket, still wearing the hospital identification bracelet that I'd saved in his baby book. In the picture, he couldn't have been more than a few hours old, his face red and tear-streaked, but peaceful, as if someone had just promised him everything would be all right. David's letter was written in the careful script he'd used for important documents, the handwriting he reserved for matters of the heart. "My dearest Rebecca," it began, "if you are reading this, then someone has questioned your right to be Adrian's mother. I always feared this day might come, which is why I prepared this letter so many years ago. Adrian came to us as a gift from a woman named Jennifer Morrison, a nurse I worked with during my residency. She couldn't keep him, Rebecca. She was barely 19 years old, unmarried, terrified of her family's reaction. She gave birth in secret and made the heartbreaking decision to give him up so he could have the life she couldn't provide. I had to stop reading as tears blurred my vision." The letter continued. "I was there when he was born. Jennifer asked me to be there because she had no one else, no family or friends who knew about the pregnancy. She placed him in my arms and asked me to find him a good home, to ensure he went to parents who would love him unconditionally. I brought him home to you the next day, Rebecca. I told you I'd arranged a private adoption through hospital channels, which was true. What I didn't tell you was that I knew his birth mother personally, that I'd been present at his birth, that Jennifer had specifically asked me to make sure he was safe. My hands shook as I read the next paragraph. I never told you the complete story because I wanted Adrian to feel that he had always been ours, that there was never a moment when he was anything other than our son. Jennifer made me promise to love him as my own, and I have. You have. We chose him, Rebecca, and that choice made him ours more completely than biology ever could. Jennifer signed away all parental rights and moved across the country shortly after the birth. She wanted a clean break, wanted Adrian to never wonder about a birth mother who might come back into his life. She gave him to us completely, trusting that we would give him the family she couldn't. The letter grew harder to read as David's handwriting became slightly less steady, as if the effort of writing had begun to exhaust him. I protected this secret because I was afraid of what might happen if Adrian learned the truth from the wrong person at the wrong time. I was afraid he might feel abandoned or unwanted, when the reality is that both his birth mother and his adoptive parents chose him out of pure love. Jennifer chose to give him life, and then chose to give him a better life than she could provide. We chose to make him our son in every legal and emotional sense. That's what family means, Rebecca. Choice, sacrifice, showing up every day, and putting someone else's needs before your own. The letter concluded with words that broke me. I have always protected this family, even in death. I will continue to protect it. Trust Margaret. She knows everything, and she will help you when the time comes. All my love, forever and always, David. I wept at that kitchen table. Not for the inheritance Meredith wanted to steal, not for the dignity she'd tried to strip away, but for the secret my husband had carried alone to protect his son, for the nurse who'd made an impossible choice, for the family we'd built on a foundation of love rather than biology. Adrian was adopted. He'd never known, and now Meredith was using this secret as a weapon against us both. I thought of Jennifer Morrison, a woman I'd never met but whose child I'd loved for 38 years. I thought of David, carrying this truth alone, protecting Adrian and me from knowledge he feared might hurt us. Blood doesn't define family, I whispered to the empty kitchen. I raised him. I loved him. He is my son. My phone rang, shattering the silence. Margaret Winter's name appeared on the screen. Rebecca, she said without preamble, her voice tight with urgency. I've been reviewing my office records, and I've discovered something disturbing. Meredith visited my office 5 times in the months before David died. She claimed to be helping organize family documents, but my assistant remembers her asking very specific questions about sealed files and confidential records. My blood ran cold. What are you saying? I'm saying she was searching for something, Rebecca. And based on what she's done since David's death, I think she found it. She knew about the adoption before any of this started. She's been planning this attack for years. I didn't hear from Adrian for 3 days after Margaret's phone call. I waited by the phone like an anxious parent, checking for messages every hour, rehearsing conversations that might never happen. When he finally appeared at my door on the 4th morning, he looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his clothes were rumpled as if he'd been wearing them for days. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation. His movements were jerky and agitated, nothing like the controlled shell of a man I'd seen at Meredith's side. "I need you to tell me the truth, Mom. All of it." I closed the door slowly, buying myself time to think. What happened, Adrian? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Only bitterness and pain. What happened? I'll tell you what happened. 3 nights ago, I came home early from a business trip. Meredith didn't hear me come in. She was in our office, stuffing a folder into the back of her filing cabinet, like it was something she needed to hide desperately. He began pacing the length of my living room, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I recognized from his teenage years, when the world seemed too heavy. When I asked her about it, she exploded, started screaming about trust, about everything she's done for our family, about how I never appreciate her sacrifices. It was like watching a mask slip, Mom, like seeing someone I'd never met before wearing my wife's face. Adrian, I began, but he held up his hand. Let me finish. After she went to sleep, I went back to that filing cabinet. I had to know what she was hiding. What was so important she'd rather fight than explain? His voice cracked. I found a folder full of documents, Mom. Old documents. And right there on top was a piece of paper I never knew existed. He stopped pacing and looked at me with eyes that held equal parts pain and confusion. My adoption certificate. Signed, sealed, legal, dated 38 years ago. His voice dropped to a whisper. I'm adopted, Mom. And she knew. Meredith knew, and she never told me. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with decades of secrets finally breaking free. I started thinking about everything, Adrian continued, his voice gaining strength as anger began to replace shock. All the little things that never quite added up. The way Meredith always avoided talking about how she met our family. She mentioned once, early in our relationship, that she'd heard about the Hartleys, had some connection to people who knew us. But when I asked what she meant, she changed the subject. I let it go because I was in love, because I didn't want to question the best thing that had ever happened to me. He laughed bitterly at his own naivety. I confronted her this morning, showed her the certificate, demanded to know how long she'd known, why she'd kept it from me. His hands clenched in the fists at his sides. She didn't even try to deny it, Mom. She went cold, completely cold. Said she'd found out years ago that she was protecting me from the painful truth that you and Dad had lied to me my entire life. Adrian, we never lied to you, I said, my voice breaking. Your father and I, we chose you. We loved you from the moment Jennifer Morrison placed you in our arms. We didn't tell you because we wanted you to feel that you'd always been ours, that nothing could ever change that. Jennifer Morrison? He looked at me with confusion written across his face. Who is that? Your birth mother. She was a nurse who worked with your father during his residency. She was 19 years old, unmarried, terrified. She gave birth to you in secret and made the heartbreaking decision to give you up so you could have the family she couldn't provide. Your father was there when you were born. She asked him to find you a good home, and he brought you to me. We adopted you legally, with love, and we never regretted it for a single day. Adrian's face crumpled, years of certainty collapsing into rubble. But before grief could fully take hold, anger flared in his eyes again. I asked Meredith how long she'd really known. Before our wedding? Before we even started dating? His voice grew louder with each question. She just smiled at me, Mom. That cold, calculating smile I've seen her use on business rivals and people she considers beneath her. And you know what she said? I waited, my heart pounding. She said, of course I knew before we got married, Adrian. His voice broke completely now, tears streaming down his face. And when I asked why she married me, if she knew I wasn't really a Hartley by blood, she just kept smiling. He met my eyes, and in them I saw the final death of his innocence. She said, why do you think I chose you? Like I was a business investment, Mom. Like our entire marriage was just a strategy to get access to you and Dad's money. The morning of the DNA results felt like walking toward an execution. I dressed in my best suit, the navy blue one David had always said brought out my eyes, and drove to Dr. Harrison's clinic with a strange calm settling over my heart. I knew what the results would say. I'd known since reading David's letter. The only question that remained was how Adrian would receive the truth and whether any part of our relationship could survive the revelation. Margaret Winters met me in the parking lot, her expression grave but determined. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. "I've had 38 years to prepare," I replied. "I just never thought it would happen like this." We entered the clinic together and found Meredith already seated in Dr. Harrison's conference room, her posture radiating triumph. She wore a scarlet dress that made her look like a predator, dressed for celebration, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. When she saw me, her eyes glittered with barely concealed victory. "Rebecca," she said sweetly, "I was beginning to think you might not show up. Cold feet, perhaps?" I took my seat without responding. Margaret settled beside me, her briefcase resting on her lap like a shield. Adrian arrived last, and when he walked through the door, I barely recognized him. His face was haggard, his eyes hollow, his movements carrying the weight of a man whose entire world had collapsed. He didn't look at Meredith as he sat down. He didn't look at anyone. He simply stared at the table as if the wood grain held answers to questions he couldn't bring himself to ask. Meredith frowned at his demeanor, but said nothing. She was too focused on her impending victory to notice that her husband had already begun to slip away from her. Dr. Harrison entered with a manila folder in her hands and closed the door behind her. The click of the latch sounded impossibly loud in the heavy silence. "Thank you all for coming," she said, taking her place at the head of the table. "I have the results of the DNA maternity test conducted on Rebecca Hartley and Adrian Hartley." Meredith leaned forward, her fingers interlaced on the table, her smile widening. Dr. Harrison opened the folder and read in a clinical monotone. "According to the genetic analysis performed by our laboratory and verified by an independent facility, Rebecca Hartley and Adrian Hartley share no biological DNA markers consistent with a parent-child relationship." Meredith's reaction was immediate and theatrical. She threw her hands up in triumph, her voice ringing through the room like a bell announcing victory. "I knew it! I told everyone from the beginning. She's not the real mother. This whole inheritance claim is built on a lie." She turned to Adrian, reaching for his arm with false sympathy. "Honey, I'm so sorry you had to find out this way. But at least now we know the truth. Your mother had secrets, and Rebecca has been pretending all these years. We finally have proof." The room waited for chaos, for shouting, for denials, for the explosive confrontation Meredith clearly expected. Instead, I stood slowly from my chair and straightened my jacket with steady hands. "I know," I said, my voice calm and clear. "I have always known." Meredith's smile froze. "What?" "Adrian is my son by choice, not by blood." I looked at my boy, at the shattered man sitting across from me who had been manipulated by his wife for over a decade. David and I adopted him when he was an infant, after his birth mother gave him up. Her name was Jennifer Morrison, and she was a nurse who worked with your father during his residency. She was 19 years old and had no family support. She gave birth to you in secret and made the heartbreaking decision to give you up so you could have the life she couldn't provide. The silence that followed was absolute. We never told you because we didn't want you to feel different. We didn't want you to carry the weight of that knowledge when it changed nothing about how much we loved you. You were ours from the moment we held you. Biology had nothing to do with it." I turned to address the room, my gaze settling briefly on Meredith's stricken face. And for those wondering about Jennifer Morrison, the name that appeared in David's medical records, she was not an affair. There was no betrayal. There was only a frightened teenage girl's wish, and two people who loved a child enough to make him their own. Jennifer gave up all parental rights and moved away shortly after the birth. She wanted Adrian to have a clean start with a family who would never make him feel unwanted. Adrian finally looked up, tears streaming down his face. His voice came out broken, barely above a whisper. "You chose me?" I walked around the table and knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in mine the way I'd done when he was small and frightened of thunderstorms. "We chose you, Adrian. Your father and I chose you the day Jennifer placed you in our arms, and we would choose you again every single day for the rest of our lives. You or my son. No test, no document, no scheming woman can ever change that." Adrian broke down completely, sobbing into my shoulder, while Meredith sat frozen in her chair, her victory crumbling to ash around her. Dr. Harrison cleared her throat softly. "There's one more matter I need to address." We all turned to her, even Adrian wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Dr. David Hartley visited this clinic 6 years ago and left something in my care. A video testimony, recorded and witnessed, with specific instructions about when it should be revealed." She looked at Margaret, then at me. "He specified that it should only be played if this exact situation occurred, if someone formally challenged Rebecca's maternal rights and demanded DNA evidence." She paused, her expression solemn. "He said the video would explain everything. Attorney Winters, I believe you have the original copy in your possession." Dr. Hartley wanted it played for the family immediately following the DNA results. Margaret nodded and opened her briefcase, withdrawing a small USB drive. David recorded this message when he first learned about his heart condition, years before his stroke. He knew this day might come, and he wanted to speak for himself when it did. Margaret connected the USB drive to Dr. Harrison's laptop, and she turned the monitor so everyone in the room could see. The screen flickered briefly before an image appeared that stole the breath from my lungs. David sat in our study, in the leather chair by the fireplace where he'd spent so many evenings reading medical journals and planning our retirement. The video had been recorded in winter, judging by the snow visible through the window behind him, and he wore the gray cardigan I'd given him for his birthday that year. He was thinner than I remembered, the illness already beginning its work, but his eyes were clear and sharp as they'd always been. When he spoke, his voice filled the room like a ghost returning home. "My name is David Hartley, and I'm recording this message of my own free will on January 22nd, 6 years ago today." He paused, folding his hands in his lap, with the quiet dignity that had defined his entire life. "If you are watching this, then something has happened that I hoped would never come to pass. Someone has questioned Rebecca's right to be Adrian's mother. Someone has tried to use our family's most precious secret as a weapon." I heard Adrian draw a sharp breath beside me. I reached for his hand and held it tightly. David continued, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I need to tell you a story about love and loss and the choices we make when there are no good options left. 38 years ago, a young nurse named Jennifer Morrison came to me with news that would change all of our lives. She was pregnant, unmarried, terrified of her family's reaction. She had no support system, no resources, no way to provide for a child. She was planning to give the baby up for adoption through an agency, but she asked me if I knew anyone who might want to adopt her child privately." David's eyes glistened in the recording, but he didn't cry. He'd always been stronger than anyone gave him credit for. I told her about Rebecca and me. We'd been married for 5 years and had been trying unsuccessfully to have children. The doctors had told us it was unlikely we'd ever conceive naturally. Jennifer asked if we would consider adopting her baby, and I promised her I would talk to Rebecca. His voice softened, heavy with old emotion. Rebecca said yes immediately. She didn't hesitate for even a moment. When Jennifer gave birth, I was there at her request because she had no one else. And when she placed that newborn boy in my arms and asked me to give him the life she couldn't provide, I promised her I would love him as my own son. David leaned forward slightly in the recording, and his expression changed. The softness faded, replaced by something harder, more resolute. I have always feared that someone might discover this truth and try to use it against my family. Someone who sees relationships as transactions, who measures love in dollars and inheritance clauses. Someone who married into our family, not for Adrian's heart, but for access to what Rebecca and I built over a lifetime of hard work. His eyes seemed to bore directly through the screen, and I saw Meredith flinch as if struck. I'm not a fool. I've watched. I've noticed the questions about our finances, the sudden interest in estate planning, the subtle ways certain people have tried to separate my son from his mother. I've seen the manipulation, the isolation, the careful dismantling of trust that happens when a predator identifies its prey. The room had gone completely still. Even Dr. Harrison seemed frozen, caught in the spell of a dead man's testimony. So, I prepared, David continued. I documented everything. I created safeguards that would activate only if someone tried to challenge Rebecca's place in this family. I left evidence with Margaret Winters, my attorney and my friend, with instructions to reveal it only when the time was right. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was gentle once more, filled with the warmth I remembered so well. Adrian, my son, if you are watching this, please know that you were wanted. You were chosen. Your mother and I loved you from the first moment we held you, and that love has never wavered for a single day. It's not blood that makes a family. Choice does. Sacrifice does. Showing up every day and putting someone else's needs before your own does. Rebecca is your mother in every way that matters, and nothing anyone says can change that. Adrian was sobbing openly now, his body shaking with grief and relief and the overwhelming weight of 38 years of hidden truth. I pulled him close, letting him cry against my shoulder, as I'd done when he was small, and the world seemed too frightening to face alone. You are my son, I whispered into his hair. Nothing changes that. Nothing ever could. On the screen, David's expression hardened one final time. He looked directly into the camera, with the fierce protectiveness of a father defending his family from beyond the grave. And to whoever is trying to hurt my family, whoever orchestrated this attack on my wife and my son, I want you to know something. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of absolute certainty. I know who you are. I have been watching you for years, and I've been preparing for this exact moment. He smiled then, a cold smile I'd rarely seen on his face in life. Margaret has everything, every document, every record, every piece of evidence I gathered. And when she reveals what I left behind, you will understand that you made a terrible mistake when you chose to target my family. The screen went black, and the silence that followed was deafening. I looked across the room at Meredith, who stood frozen in the corner, her face pale as death, her triumphant smile long since crumbled to dust. David had known. He'd always known. And even from beyond the grave, he was still protecting us. The conference room erupted into chaos the moment David's video ended. Adrian pulled away from my embrace and turned on Meredith with a fury I'd never seen in him before. His face was streaked with tears, but his eyes burned with the fire of a man who'd finally seen the truth he'd been blind to for over a decade. Stop! You knew, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You knew I was adopted before we ever got married. That's why you chose me, isn't it? Not because you loved me, but because you saw an opportunity to get to my parents' money. Meredith raised her hands in a gesture of innocence that might have been convincing years ago. Adrian, darling, you're upset. You're not thinking clearly. Yes, I found out about the adoption, but that doesn't change how I feel about you. I fell in love with you, not some inheritance. Stop lying. Adrian slammed his fist on the table, making everyone in the room jump. I've spent 10 years listening to your lies, and I'm done. I remember everything now. Every little comment, every suggestion, every time you pushed me to claim what's rightfully ours. You've been playing me from the beginning. He began pacing, his words tumbling out like water breaking through a dam. You always found reasons to keep me away from Mom. Every holiday, every birthday, there was always some excuse why we couldn't visit or why she shouldn't come to our house. You said she was too controlling, too old-fashioned, too stuck in the past. But it was never about her, was it? It was about keeping me isolated, so you could fill my head with your poison. Meredith's mask was slipping, her composure cracking at the edges. Everything I did was for us, Adrian, for our future. Our future? He laughed bitterly. You mean your future. You were always asking about the estate, always wanting to know exactly what Mom and Dad owned, always pushing me to talk to lawyers about inheritance laws. I thought you were just being practical, looking out for our family. His voice broke. But we were never a family to you, were we? We were just a means to an end. I watched my son unravel years of manipulation in a matter of minutes, each memory clicking into place like pieces of a puzzle he'd refused to see. Part of me ached for him, for the pain of realizing the woman he loved had never loved him at all. But another part of me felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Adrian stopped pacing and walked toward me, his steps uncertain. Mom, he said, and his voice cracked on the single word. I'm so sorry. I should have trusted you. All those years, all those times I took her side against you, all the dinners I missed and phone calls I didn't return. You never stopped loving me, and I repaid you by believing her lies over your truth. I stood and opened my arms, and for the first time in what felt like forever, my son walked into them without hesitation. You're still my son, I said, holding him tightly. That's all that matters. That's all that has ever mattered. We stood there for a long moment, two people trying to rebuild a bridge that had been deliberately burned by someone who was supposed to love them both. I felt his shoulders shake with silent sobs, and I held him tighter, willing him to understand that nothing he'd done could ever make me stop loving him. When we finally separated, I noticed that Meredith had disappeared from the room. Dr. Harrison gestured toward the hallway. She stepped out to make a phone call, said it was urgent. Margaret and I exchanged glances. Nothing about Meredith was ever innocent, especially not now. I excused myself and moved quietly toward the partially open door that led to the clinic's back corridor. Meredith stood near the emergency exit, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice a harsh whisper that carried further than she realized. The plan failed, she hissed into the phone. They know everything. The old man left a video. Can you believe it? He documented the whole adoption story and practically accused me on camera. A pause. No, we can't salvage this. We need to move to Plan B immediately. Start transferring what we can before they freeze the accounts. My blood ran cold. She wasn't just a manipulator. She was a thief, and she had an accomplice. Just do it, Meredith snapped. I don't care about the risks anymore. If we don't move fast, we lose everything. She ended the call and stood for a moment with her back to me, her shoulders rising and falling with rapid breaths. I retreated silently before she could turn around, my mind racing with the implications of what I'd just heard. Back in her conference room, Adrian sat with his head in his hands while Margaret reviewed something on her phone. She looked up when I entered, and her expression told me the situation had just become significantly worse. Rebecca, she said quietly, pulling me aside. I need to speak with you privately. We stepped into Dr. Harrison's office, and Margaret closed the door behind us. I found the proof David mentioned in his video, she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I've been going through the financial records he left in my care, and the evidence is damning. Meredith has been stealing from David's accounts for the past 2 years. Small amounts at first, easily overlooked, but they added up. $93,000 total, siphoned through various transfers and cash withdrawals. I felt sick. David was dying. He was too weak to manage his own finances during those final months." "Exactly." Margaret's jaw tightened. "Meredith took advantage of that. But here's the worst part, Rebecca. She didn't act alone. The transfers were routed through a secondary account held by someone else. Someone who's been helping her orchestrate this entire scheme from the very beginning." Margaret spread bank records across Dr. Harrison's desk with the methodical precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence. Each page told a story of betrayal, written in numbers and dates, a trail of theft that spanned the final year of David's life. "Look at this," Margaret said, pointing to a series of highlighted transactions. Starting 8 months before David passed, regular withdrawals began appearing from his primary checking account. 3,000 here, 2,000 there, always just under the threshold that would trigger automatic bank alerts. Over those 8 months, Meredith withdrew a total of $93,000. I stared at the documents, feeling physically ill. David was in and out of the hospital during that time. He could barely manage his medication schedule, let alone monitor his bank accounts. "Exactly," Margaret continued. "Meredith knew that. She had access to David's financial information because Adrian had given her temporary authorization to help with household bills while you were both focused on David's care. She abused that trust systematically and deliberately. The door to the office opened, and Adrian stepped inside. His face still blotchy from crying, but his eyes now sharp with determination. "I want to know everything," he said. "I'm done being kept in the dark." Margaret nodded and gestured for him to join us. "You deserve to know, Adrian. This involves you more than anyone." She pulled out another document, this one older, with David's handwriting visible in the margins. "This is where it gets interesting," Margaret continued. "David knew about the theft. He discovered it about 4 months before he died, when he noticed discrepancies in his account statements during a rare period of clarity between treatments." Adrian frowned. "If he knew, why didn't he report it? Why didn't he tell anyone?" "Because your father was playing a longer game," Margaret said, her expression holding a mixture of admiration and sadness. "David documented everything, every withdrawal, every transfer. Every piece of evidence that proved Meredith was stealing from him. But he didn't report it because he wanted to use it as leverage. He knew that confronting Meredith directly would only result in denial and manipulation. So he waited. Waited for what? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. For Meredith to trigger the trap herself. Margaret held up David's handwritten notes. "David wrote this. She will not stop at theft. She married Adrian for access to our family, and she will eventually try to remove Rebecca from the equation entirely. When she makes her move, when she challenges Rebecca's place in this family, everything I have gathered will be used against her. Let her think she is winning. Let her grow bold. The higher she climbs, the harder she will fall." The room fell silent as the full weight of David's strategy became clear. My husband had spent his dying months not just fighting illness, but preparing a battlefield for a war he knew would come after he was gone. Margaret pulled out one final document, and her expression grew even more serious. "There's something else. The money Meredith stole wasn't deposited into her personal accounts. It was routed through a secondary account held by another person." She turned the page to reveal bank statements with a different name at the top. Diane Crawford, Meredith's mother. Adrian went pale. "Her mother? What does her mother have to do with this?" "Everything, apparently. Margaret handed him a printed email chain that David had somehow obtained and preserved. According to David's investigation, Diane didn't just help launder the stolen money, she orchestrated the entire scheme from the very beginning. I watched my son read the emails, watched his face transform from confusion to horror to a devastation so complete it seemed to hollow him out from the inside. "These emails are from 13 years ago," he whispered. "Before Meredith and I even met. Her mother is talking about the Hartley opportunity and positioning Meredith for maximum access." He looked up, his eyes wild. "She introduced us at that charity gala. Her mother introduced us. She said it was coincidence, that she just happened to know someone who knew my parents. If you feel my words reaching your heart, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Tell me which city you're from, so I can see how far a woman's voice can travel when she speaks the truth. Help me build this community so we can bring more stories like this to women who need to hear them." Meredith's voice cut through the room like a blade. None of us had heard her return, but she stood in the doorway now, her arms crossed, her expression no longer bothering to hide the coldness beneath. "So you finally figured it out," she said, her voice flat and unemotional. "Congratulations, Adrian. It only took you a decade." Adrian turned to face her, his hands shaking. "Your mother set us up from the beginning. Our entire marriage was a con." Meredith shrugged, a gesture so casual it bordered on contemptuous. "She taught me to take what I deserve. The world doesn't give anything to women like us, Adrian. We have to take it. Your family had money, status, everything my mother never had. She saw an opportunity, and she prepared me to seize it. And I almost had everything," she continued, her eyes flickering briefly with something that might have been regret or might have been merely annoyance at being caught. "If that paranoid old man hadn't been so careful, if he'd just died quietly like he was supposed to, none of this would have come out. You would have lived your whole life believing I loved you, and I would have gotten exactly what I was owed." Adrian staggered backward as if she'd physically struck him. I caught his arm, steadying him, feeling the tremor that ran through his entire body. Margaret stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of legal authority. "Meredith, I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to read." She opened David's will to a page marked with a red tab. Article 14, Section C. Any party who commits financial fraud, theft, or misappropriation against David Hartley or his estate, either during his lifetime or after his death, shall automatically and irrevocably forfeit all inheritance rights. Furthermore, all documented evidence of such fraud shall be immediately forwarded to the appropriate law enforcement authorities for criminal prosecution. Margaret closed the folder and looked directly at Meredith. "David left instructions for me to contact the district attorney's office the moment I had sufficient evidence of your crimes. That call was made 30 minutes ago while you were in the hallway plotting with your mother." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Meredith, you just lost everything. The inheritance, your freedom, and whatever scraps of dignity you thought you still possessed." Meredith's composure shattered like glass hitting concrete. For a moment, she stood frozen, processing Margaret's words, calculating her remaining options with the cold efficiency of a machine running out of power. Then her survival instincts kicked in, and she transformed into something desperate and dangerous. "You think you've won?" she snarled, her elegance dissolving into raw fury. "If you prosecute me, I'll destroy you. I'll tell everyone that Adrian is adopted, that your precious family legacy is built on lies. Every newspaper, every television station, every social media platform will know that Rebecca Hartley raised another woman's child and tried to pass him off as her own. Your reputation will be ruined." I met her threat with a calm I didn't know I possessed. Perhaps David's spirit was with me in that moment, lending me his strength. Everyone already knows, Meredith. We told the truth today, in this room, with witnesses present. Adrian knows he was adopted. I know. Margaret knows. Dr. Harrison knows. There is no scandal left for you to expose. No secret weapon hidden in your arsenal. We have nothing to hide anymore. Her face contorted with frustrated rage as she realized her primary leverage had evaporated. She spun toward Adrian, her tactics shifting from threat to manipulation, her voice suddenly soft and pleading. Adrian, baby, please. You have to understand. Everything I did was for us, for our future together. Yes, my mother helped me see the opportunity, but I grew to love you. I really did. We can still work this out. We can take whatever inheritance is left and start over somewhere new. Just the two of us. She reached for his hands, her eyes filling with tears that might have been genuine or might have been her final performance. Adrian pulled away as if her touch burned him. No, he said, his voice steady despite the pain etched across his face. You didn't do this for us. You did it for yourself. I was never your husband. I was your tool, your access card to a vault you'd been planning to rob since before you even knew my name. He took another step backward, putting distance between them that felt permanent. Our entire marriage was a lie. Every kiss, every promise, every time you said you loved me, all of it was calculated. Every moment was part of a plan your mother created before we even met. Something broke inside Meredith then. The composed businesswoman, the sophisticated manipulator, the careful schemer who'd spent years building her con, all of it fell away. What remained was raw and ugly and utterly uncontrolled. That man knew, she screamed, her voice echoing off the walls. David set me up from the beginning. He let me take that money, let me think I was getting away with it, just so he could trap me later. What kind of sick person does that? He was dying, and he spent his last months building a cage for me instead of making peace with his family. I should have known something was wrong when he never questioned the withdrawals. $93,000, and he never said a word, never changed the account passwords, never revoked my access. He wanted me to steal it. He wanted evidence he could use against me when the time came. Margaret and I exchanged glances. Meredith had just confessed to theft on the record, in front of multiple witnesses. But I noticed something else. Adrian had his phone in his hand, held low at his side, the screen faintly illuminated. He saw me looking and gave an almost imperceptible nod. He was recording everything. Later he would explain that he'd started the recording the moment Meredith returned to the room, some instinct warning him that her reaction might prove useful. Our state allowed one-party consent for recordings, meaning Adrian had every legal right to document what was being said. Meredith's confession, her admission of theft, her acknowledgement that David had caught her, all of it was now preserved as admissible evidence. The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced what came next. 2 police officers appeared in the doorway, their expressions professional and impassive. Margaret must have coordinated with them before confronting Meredith, ensuring they would arrive at precisely the right moment. Meredith Crawford Hartley? The older officer asked, though it was clearly a formality. Meredith's face went white. This is a mistake. I have rights. I want my lawyer. You'll have access to legal counsel at the station, the officer replied, producing handcuffs. Meredith Crawford Hartley, you are under arrest for elder financial abuse, fraud, and theft. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The click of the handcuffs closing around her wrists was the most satisfying sound I'd heard in years. As they led her toward the door, she twisted to look back at Adrian one final time, and all pretense of love or regret vanished from her features. You'll regret this, she screamed, her voice cracking with venom. You're nothing without me, Adrian. Nothing. You think your precious mommy will save you? You're not even her real son. Adrian flinched, but didn't look away. I know exactly who I am now, he said quietly. And I know exactly who you are. That's the difference between us. The officers pulled her through the door, and her screams faded down the hallway until they disappeared entirely. The silence that followed Meredith's removal felt sacred, like the hush inside a cathedral after the congregation has departed. Adrian stood motionless by the window, staring at the parking lot below, where police cars still flashed their lights. I wanted to go to him, to offer comfort, but something told me he needed a moment alone with his shattered reality. Margaret cleared her throat softly. "There's one more thing," she said, reaching into her briefcase with an expression that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment since we first gathered in this room. David left specific instructions. This envelope was only to be opened after Meredith was arrested. She held up a cream-colored envelope, thicker than the others, with David's handwriting clearly visible on the front. The words read, "For my family, when justice has been served." My hands trembled as Margaret placed the envelope in my palm. The paper felt warm, as if David himself had just finished sealing it. I broke the wax seal he pressed into the back and withdrew several pages of his careful handwriting, each line precise and deliberate, despite the illness that must have been ravaging his body when he wrote them. I began to read aloud, my voice unsteady but determined. Adrian turned from the window to listen, and even Dr. Harrison leaned forward. "My dearest Rebecca and Adrian," the letter began, "if Margaret has given you this envelope, then Meredith has finally faced the consequences of her actions. I want you to understand everything I did and why I did it. You deserve the complete truth." I paused to steady my breathing before continuing. "I discovered Meredith's theft 4 months before I died. It happened during one of my better days, when the pain medication allowed me to think clearly for a few hours. I was reviewing our accounts, trying to organize our finances so Rebecca wouldn't be burdened after I was gone, when I noticed the discrepancies. Small withdrawals, carefully spaced, designed to avoid detection. The work of someone who had studied our accounts carefully and knew exactly how to exploit them. Adrian made a sound like a wounded animal, but I pressed on. My first instinct was to confront her immediately, to expose her crime and protect our family. But then I thought about what would happen next. Meredith would deny everything. She would manipulate Adrian into defending her, just as she had manipulated him into doubting his own mother. She would claim the withdrawals were authorized, that I had agreed to them during moments of confusion. It would become her word against mine, and I knew I wouldn't live long enough to see the case through court. David's voice seemed to echo in my mind as I read his words, his logic as sharp and clear as it had been in life. So I made a different choice. I let her continue stealing. Every dollar she took became another piece of evidence. Every visit she made to Margaret's office, pretending to help with estate planning while actually searching for information, was documented and recorded. I gave her enough rope to hang herself, and I knew that eventually she would tie the noose around her own neck. Margaret nodded solemnly, confirming what the letter described. She'd been part of this plan from the beginning, David's trusted ally in a war fought from a hospital bed. I knew Meredith wouldn't stop at theft. The letter continued. Her ultimate goal was always the inheritance, and I knew she would eventually try to remove Rebecca from the equation entirely. The adoption was her weapon of choice, the secret she had discovered years ago and kept hidden until she needed it. I could see it coming as clearly as I could see the illness consuming my body. My vision blurred with tears, but I forced myself to keep reading. So I built a trap. The DNA test would be the trigger, the event that would set everything in motion. I knew Meredith would push for it eventually, believing it would disinherit Rebecca and give her full control over Adrian's share. But I wrote the will clauses to term her own attack against her. The moment she formally challenged Rebecca's maternal rights, she forfeited her inheritance claims. The moment she triggered the investigation, all the evidence of her theft would come to light. I had to stop, the words swimming before my eyes, as the full scope of David's planning became clear. He'd spent his dying months not succumbing to despair, but engineering justice. He'd transformed his own mortality into a shield that would protect his family long after he was gone. The DNA test was the trigger. I read, my voice breaking. The will clause was the lock. And this letter is the key. Together they form a trap that Meredith built for herself. Brick by brick, theft by theft, lie by lie. I simply made sure the walls were high enough that she could never climb out. Adrian crossed the room and stood beside me, reading over my shoulder. Tears streamed down his face as he saw his father's final message. Rebecca, my love, I continued reading. If you are reading this, then you have won. Justice has been served, and our family is safe. But winning is not enough. Now you must heal. David's handwriting grew slightly less steady in the final paragraphs, as if the effort of writing had begun to exhaust him. Forgive Adrian. He was also her victim, perhaps even more than you. She manipulated him from the day they met, twisted his love into a weapon against his own mother. He will need time to recover, and he will need you to show him what real family looks like. Be patient with him. He is still your son, and he always will be. I reached for Adrian's hand and held it tightly as I read the final lines. Find happiness again, Rebecca. That is my final wish. Do not spend the rest of your life mourning what we lost. Honor what we built. Live fully, love deeply, and remember that I will be watching over you always. The letter was signed with David's name, but beneath his signature was a postscript that made my heart skip. P.S. Margaret has one more envelope. Do not open it today. Open it when you're ready to live again. You will know when that time has come. Trust yourself, my love, and trust that even in death, I'm still taking care of you. I looked at Margaret through my tears, and she nodded, patting her briefcase gently. Whenever you're ready, Rebecca. He made me promise to keep it safe until you asked for it. The trial took place 7 weeks later in the county courthouse, a dignified building of limestone and marble that had witnessed decades of justice being served. I sat in the front row with Adrian beside me, both of us dressed in our best clothes, united for the first time in years against a common enemy. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and old paper, and every seat was filled with spectators drawn by the scandal that had captivated our community. Meredith sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, her designer clothes and expensive jewelry replaced by the uniform of the incarcerated. She'd aged visibly in the weeks since her arrest, the stress stripping away the polished veneer to reveal something harder and more desperate beneath. Her attorney, a harried-looking man who'd taken the case pro bono for the publicity, shuffled papers with the resigned air of someone who knew he was fighting a losing battle. The charges were read aloud. Elder financial abuse in the first degree, fraud, inheritance fraud, conspiracy. Each count carried its own weight, its own potential for punishment, and together they painted a portrait of calculated cruelty that made even the most hardened courtroom observers shift uncomfortably in their seats. But the true spectacle came when Diane Crawford was brought in to testify. Meredith's mother had been arrested 3 weeks after her daughter, caught trying to withdraw funds from the secondary account that had received the stolen money. She shuffled to the witness stand in her own orange jumpsuit, her once imperious bearing reduced to the hunched posture of a woman who'd finally run out of schemes. The prosecutor's questions were surgical and precise. Diane squirmed under each one, her eyes darting around the courtroom as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "I had nothing to do with any of this," she insisted, her voice climbing to a desperate pitch. "Meredith acted alone. She planned everything herself. I was just a mother, trying to help her daughter manage some finances. I had no idea where that money came from. From the defense table, Meredith's head snapped up. For a moment, mother and daughter locked eyes, and I witnessed something I never expected to see. Meredith's expression shifted from desperation to pure, unfiltered disgust. "You taught me everything," Meredith said, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear, despite her attorney's frantic attempts to silence her. "You pointed me at that family like a weapon. You told me exactly what to do and how to do it. And now you're going to sit there and pretend you were innocent?" The judge called for order, but the damage was done. Diane's carefully constructed defense crumbled as her own daughter confirmed her involvement. The manipulator had been abandoned by her protege, betrayed by the very tactics she'd taught. When the time came for victim statements, the prosecutor called my name. I rose slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room upon me, and made my way to the podium that faced the judge's bench. I'd written and rewritten my statement a dozen times, trying to find the right words to express what this ordeal had cost me and my family. In the end, I spoke from the heart. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "I stand before you not as a woman seeking revenge. Revenge is for those who have nothing left to lose. And despite everything that has happened, I still have my son. I still have my memories of my husband. I still have the life we built together over 43 years of marriage." I paused, gathering my thoughts. What I seek is restoration. Justice is not about punishment for its own sake. It is about setting things right, about ensuring that those who prey upon the vulnerable cannot continue to do so. My husband David understood this. Even as he was dying, he worked to protect our family from those who would exploit us. He believed in justice, not vengeance, and I honor his memory by believing the same. I looked directly at Meredith for the first time since taking the stand. I hope that someday you find whatever peace is available to you. But I also hope that you spend every day of your sentence remembering that the woman you tried to rob and the family you tried to destroy were stronger than your schemes. David saw you clearly when no one else did. And in the end, truth won. I returned to my seat as the judge began her sentencing remarks. Meredith received 8 years with the possibility of parole after 6 for good behavior. Diane received 5 years as an accomplice. As the bailiffs moved to escort them from the courtroom, I saw tears streaming down Meredith's face for the first time since this nightmare began. But I knew those tears weren't from remorse. They were the tears of someone who had lost everything she'd schemed to obtain. "I had it all planned perfectly," she whispered as they led her past our row. "How did that dying old man see everything before it happened?" I didn't answer. Some questions carry their own responses. Outside the courthouse, the autumn air was crisp and clean, a welcome relief after the stuffy tension of the courtroom. I stood on the steps breathing deeply, trying to process the closure that the verdict had provided. Adrian appeared beside me, his face pale but determined. "Mom," he said quietly, and his voice cracked on the single word. "Can you ever forgive me for what I did? For all those years I chose her side over yours?" I looked at my son, standing on those courthouse steps, his eyes red from tears he'd been fighting all day, his shoulders carrying the weight of guilt that no verdict could erase. The autumn wind stirred the fallen leaves around our feet, and for a moment, I saw the little boy I'd raised, the child who used to run into my arms after school, the young man who'd slowly been stolen from me by a woman who never deserved him. "Let's go home," I said. "There's something I want to show you." We drove in silence to the house where Adrian had grown up. The house where David and I had created a life filled with love and laughter and the quiet strength that had protected us even after his death. I led him through the back gate to the garden I'd tended with David's help, the flower beds now dormant in the cooling weather, but still beautiful in their autumn rest. We sat on the wooden bench David had chosen for this exact spot, positioned to catch the afternoon sun and overlook the roses we'd planted when Adrian was still young enough to help us dig in the dirt. "Tell me about her," Adrian said quietly. "My birth mother, Jennifer. I need to know who she was." I closed my eyes and let the memories surface, images David had shared with me nearly 4 decades ago. "Jennifer was a nurse at the hospital where your father completed his residency. They worked together, became friends. She was brave, Adrian. Braver than anyone I've ever known." "When she got sick? I mean, when she found herself pregnant," I corrected myself. "When she realized she couldn't keep you." "She didn't waste time on self-pity or fear. She made the hardest decision a mother can make." Adrian listened with his whole body, leaning toward me as if afraid to miss a single word. "She loved you more than life itself. You were still growing inside her when she came to your father and asked him if he knew anyone who might want to adopt her baby. She wanted to choose your family herself. Wanted to make sure you went to people who would love you unconditionally. When your father told her about us, about how much we wanted a child, she said yes immediately." My voice broke on the last words, but I pressed on. "We didn't adopt you out of obligation, Adrian. We adopted you because the moment your father brought you home, the moment I held you for the first time, I knew that Jennifer had given us the greatest gift anyone could ever receive. You became our son, not through paperwork or legal proceedings, but through the choice we made every single day to put your needs before our own. That's what family means. That's what Jennifer wanted for you." Adrian buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and long suppressed. "I wasted so many years," he choked out. "Doubting you, following her orders, treating you like an enemy when you were the only real parent I ever had. I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry for everything." I put my arm around him and pulled him close, the way I'd done when he was small and frightened of the dark. "Forgiveness is a journey, Adrian, not a destination. We'll walk it together, one step at a time. What matters now is that we're here, that we found our way back to each other. Your father would be proud of you for having the courage to face the truth." We sat together until the sun began to set, talking about everything and nothing, rebuilding the bridge that Meredith had tried so hard to destroy. Adrian told me he'd already filed for divorce, that he needed to find out who he really was before he could become the son he wanted to be. "I've spent 10 years being who she wanted me to be," he said. "Now I need to figure out who I actually am. Maybe then I can become someone worthy of the sacrifice you and Dad made for me." That evening, after Adrian had gone home to begin the long process of dismantling his old life, I remembered the final envelope Margaret had mentioned. I found it in my desk drawer, where I'd placed it weeks ago, waiting for the right moment. The handwriting on the front was David's. "For Rebecca, on the day you're ready to live again." I sat in my reading chair, the same chair where I'd read so many of his letters, and took a deep breath. The paper felt warm in my hands, as if he'd just sealed it moments ago. I opened it carefully. David's handwriting filled 3 pages, each word a gift from beyond the veil that separates the living from those we have lost. I read slowly, savoring every sentence, letting his voice wash over me one final time. "My dearest Rebecca," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then you have survived the storm I saw coming long before the first clouds appeared on the horizon. You have faced betrayal, fought for justice, and emerged with your dignity intact. I'm so proud of you, my love. I always knew you were stronger than you believed yourself to be." I had to stop and wipe my eyes before continuing. Even now, months after his death, David's faith in me felt like sunlight breaking through winter clouds. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you in person. I'm sorry I had to leave you to face this battle alone. But I hope my preparations kept you safe. I hope the traps I built and the evidence I gathered gave you the weapons you needed to defeat those who wished you harm. Every hour I spent planning, every document I hid, every instruction I left with Margaret was an act of love. It was the only way I knew to hold your hand from beyond the grave. The letter continued with practical matters, explaining where he'd hidden additional documents, which accounts held emergency funds, how to contact people who could help if new threats emerged. David had thought of everything, planned for every contingency, left nothing to chance. But it was the final paragraphs that broke me completely. Now that the storm has passed, I have one more request. Use what I've left to build something beautiful. Our story does not have to end with pain and betrayal. It can become a shield for others who face what you faced, a beacon for those lost in the darkness of exploitation and abuse. There are so many elderly people in this world who have no one to protect them, no one to see the predators circling before it's too late. Help them, Rebecca. Let our story become their salvation. I set the letter down and looked around the empty room, feeling the weight of his words settling into my bones. And Rebecca, he'd written in his final lines, "Don't spend forever alone. Grief is a form of love, but it should not become a prison. Sophia Chen is a good woman. I've watched the two of you together over the years, seen the way she looks at you when she thinks no one is watching. She sees you for who you truly are, not for what you have or what you've lost. When you're ready, let her in. I want you to be happy, my love. That has always been my greatest wish." 1 year later, I stood at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the David Hartley Foundation for Elder Protection, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting elderly victims of financial abuse. The building was modest but welcoming, a converted storefront in the heart of downtown, where people could walk in without appointment and find help without judgment. Margaret Winters served on the board of directors. Dr. Harrison had agreed to provide pro bono consultations, and Adrian stood beside me, his hands steady as he helped me cut the ceremonial ribbon. My son had changed in the months since Meredith's conviction. The divorce had been finalized quickly, and he'd thrown himself into therapy with determination. He volunteered at the foundation 3 days a week, answering phones, helping with paperwork, listening to the stories of people who'd experienced betrayal similar to his own. "I understand them," he told me once. "I know what it feels like to be manipulated by someone you love, to wake up one day and realize that everything you believed was a lie. If I can help even one person avoid what happened to me, then maybe something good came out of all that pain." Watching him heal was its own form of miracle. The morning after the foundation's grand opening, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The garden David had planted was blooming again. The roses we'd tended together now flourishing under my amateur attention and Sophia's expert guidance. Sophia herself sat in the chair beside me, her silver hair catching the early light, her presence as comfortable and natural as breathing. We'd grown closer over the past year, our friendship deepening into something neither of us had expected, but both of us welcomed. She never tried to replace David. She simply walked beside me as I learned to live again. "It's beautiful," she said, nodding toward the garden. "David would be pleased." I smiled, feeling a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. He's still taking care of us. Even now, even after everything, I can feel him watching over this family. Sophia reached over and squeezed my hand, a gesture of understanding that required no words. Later that morning, Adrian would arrive to help me sort through donation requests. Margaret would call with updates on legal cases the foundation was supporting. Life would continue in all its messy, complicated, beautiful chaos. But in that quiet moment on the porch, with the woman who'd become my closest friend beside me and the garden my husband had planted blooming before us, I finally understood what David had been trying to tell me all along. I looked at his photograph on the side table, the one from our wedding day, and felt tears prick my eyes. But they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude. "Blood doesn't make family," I whispered to his memory. "Choice does. And I choose to live. For him, for Adrian, and finally, for myself." The sun continued to rise over David's garden, and somewhere in the light, in the flowers, in the gentle morning breeze, I could have sworn I heard him laughing. And so ends the story of Rebecca Hartley, a woman who discovered that the greatest battles are not fought with fists or fury, but with patience, dignity, and the unshakable love of those who truly see us. David's final gift was not money or property, but the wisdom to understand that family is never defined by blood alone. It is defined by the choices we make every single day, the sacrifices we offer without expectation of return, and the courage to stand firm when others try to tear us down. Rebecca's journey reminds us that no matter how dark the storm, the sun will rise again for those who refuse to surrender their integrity. Meredith believed she could manipulate an older woman into giving up everything she built, but she underestimated the strength that comes from decades of honest living and genuine love. In the end, the trap she set for others became her own prison, and the family she tried to destroy emerged stronger than ever before. If you feel my words resonating in your heart, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Tell me which city you're from so I can see how far a woman's voice can reach when she speaks her truth. Help me build this community so we can bring more stories like this to women who need to hear them. Your story matters, and together we can create a space where truth and justice prevail. Until next time, remember, choose love, choose truth, and never let anyone make you doubt your worth.